So what I want to ask about is in our current online environment, what tweaks might you consider doing? I don't know if you've used the unessay in online classes before, but how might you want to tweak what probably in a face-to-face the sort of celebration moment it looked like you sometimes have where everybody's bringing in their cool stuff, and so what thoughts do you have on the online environment for that
Sure.
particular project, and then others also?
Yeah, I have used it in the online environment. So in March, when we moved online, I had a big paper scheduled for my African American Lit class, and it was built on this digital project where we were looking at the Milliken Massacre, which was a 1868 race massacre about 13 miles from campus that no one seems to know about, but is really important. So I added that instead of the big paper. And what I would suggest is think about the stair-step model with this. I do it in class, but you can do some other things online. So putting students in teams perhaps. So say you have several students that are doing foodways. You could group them into a team and give them small assignments early on where they're like, hey, what are you doing? I want you to talk to your group about these 3 questions, right? So they're preparing and it's not a last minute thing, which is always the danger when you don't have them physically in class. I would build in small writing assignments because again, the 1 to 2 page paper is not really what we end up with. So what you want to think about is if you want a 10-page paper, have small writing assignments all along. Maybe they'll do a discussion board. Maybe they'll do a blog. Maybe they'll share question answers with their class. And you might have them even do short presentations, like mini group presentations, where we're the Foodways group. Here's all the stuff we're working on. So then you get the oracy in there as well. So my advice, especially when you're doing project-based stuff online, is build a structure for it. So you're not just going, hey, go do this project, come back at the end of the semester, right? Because then they flail, they don't know what they're doing. But think about how you can teach these same TEAC skills, you're getting them, but do it in a stair-step manner as you move along. And that really seemed to work for my students. And why I'm thinking about it, let me just throw this out there, because it was something I did also with both my grad and African American Lit class, and I don't have it in my slides, but I want to mention it. There's an online program called Hypothesis, and it's free. It's really easy to use. It's a little plug-in that you can teach your students to drop into their browser. And what it does is it allows you to put up a digital text. So say you're reading a poem. This little hypothesis allows them to mark things and comment on it, and it shares it with the entire class. I use that instead of just telling them to read something and then come back on Zoom and talk to me. I said to them, I want you to read this and I want you to include 1 comment and 1 response to one of your classmates' comments. I will give you credit if you just do it. Just do it. And what I found was that helped to account for that issue in classrooms online where you're like, I need questions, and it's Zoom and everybody goes, right? Because it's weird on Zoom. So the hypothesis annotation, they were forced to do it, but the conversation happened in those annotations. So I wanted to throw that out as well. I can give you all the link later and make sure you have that, but it works great. It's really easy. And the company's allowing people to use it for free because pandemic. So.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Other
All right,
questions?
Brady has a question. Do you have any suggestions or warnings about teaching short stories in a digital environment?
Yep. I think the warning or the difficulty is always just that sort of disconnect you have with your students. I don't know about your students. Mine are always a little reticent anyway, right? Like it's like sometimes pulling teeth to get them to comment, even when they've read the material. So you have that double whammy of they're away. You don't know if they've read it, right? They don't want to say anything on Zoom. So I think what developed out of the class, and here's a suggestion. So when you get on Zoom to talk about stuff, if you do the hypothesis and all that early thing, it sometimes helps to have one student assigned to function in much the way that the humanities Texas folk are doing. Give a student the assignment of, okay, today you, whomever you are, Jim, Sue, whatever, You are in charge of monitoring the question answers and the hand raises.
Yeah.
And you're going to bring that material to make sure no one gets lost. And you may even try to give them even more responsibility to that skill. Like maybe they were the person in charge of managing more of the hypothesis annotation of the short story, right? So I think sometimes with teaching not just short stories, but other literature online at a distance like this, is pushing the responsibility to them. But to do that, you have to carefully craft assignments because they're just not going to do it on their own, right? So during the end part of our pandemic classes, I had a lot of like, if you do it, you get credit for it assignments, because then it was easy, they were engaged. My students who only had a cell phone could do a lot of this stuff on their cell phone, right? So give them authority, push that authority to them, and try to come up with alternative ways of talking about the text. Like discussion boards really don't work, but I found, and I can't believe I did this. I watch my daughter, who's a teenager, and she does, group, she uses apps, right? Like she does most of her communication online through, I don't know, things like Snapchat or GroupMe. So I set up a GroupMe chat. And, we know as faculty, sometimes they are used for ill, for cheating and all those kinds of things. But I thought, you know what? I'm going to set it up and see what happens and tell my students to get in there. And they would ask questions and converse with each other like, hey, she told us we were supposed to look for X at the library secondary source. What is this thing? And they would have this conversation about it. Or they would say, did you read that? That was a weird story. And then they would have a conversation about it. And I could kind of jump in, because they were having their conversations at 2 a.m. I'm not up, right? Yeah. But so think about alternative places for them to gain authority and really deal with that stuff, because the old school ways of like lecture, they just don't work. So I hope that answered your question.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. And it cuts across not just this class that you're, sharing today, but so many other ones too. So Elizabeth has, I think, a really important question in terms of what you shared today. If you could choose just 1 to 3 Texas authors, what should we all sort of embrace, or maybe? And I know I hate that question when people say
it's hard.
But I like the way she says 1 to 3. So maybe you can throw out several that you just want us all, and it might even be for our own reading pleasure.
Sure,
right?
Sure. One of the most useful authors in terms of both what she's written and engaging with really important issues that I think you have to understand about Texas is Anzal Dua. I think starting with her idea of language and borderlands gives them a theory to talk about not just the literature, but broadly what's happening, right? Because Anzal Dua gives us language to think about when cultures come together and things blow up. When cultures come together and there's groups that sort of meld, right? Like Tex-Mex, right? Like I always think about this, right? Like the groups come together across borders and something new is developed and something beautiful is developed. So I would put Anzal Dua in the center. Students really, really are engaged when her section on, what is it? The one where she's talking about the dentist. I think it's like the 3rd chapter. She talks about going to the dentist and then the dentist tells her her tongue is too big for her mouth. And it becomes this sort of meditation on how she's been cut off from her language, because remember, you were not allowed to teach Spanish, to speak Spanish in Texas schools. There was punishment for that. So they're like, most of them are like, what is this, right? Like they can't imagine that because their parents sometimes have had this happen, but were ashamed and not shared it, right? But it gets at language issues so well. So I would put her in the center as sort of not just a writer, but theoretical model. I love teaching Cormac McCarthy. He is a stretch for even students in college. His language is dense, dense, dense. But the more I read his books, the more I'm intrigued, and they're really beautiful. Cisneros is a lovely author to read, and she excerpts well. You can pull Like I always think about the piece that's anthologized. She has a piece on, oh gosh, I'm blanking on it. Two little kids who are in Mexico visiting, as she says,
Yeah. Yeah.
the ugly grandmother. And there's this sort of moment where they're standing outside the church and these Americans come up to them and they think they're these nice little Mexican children and they're starting to take pictures, right, in all the derogative ways. And then at some point the kids are like, no, we're Americans. And it's this merger of Mexican / American that lets Cisneros sort of think about identity and how it moves and shifts. So that's really, she's really lovely. So those are three I can think of offhand. There's so much more though. There's so much more. There are a couple collections of Texas Lit that you might look at. Don Graham went out a number of years ago. The Castillo story I'm going to talk about this afternoon is anthologized, and it's really great. It has Catherine Porter. It has a lot of cowboy sort of texts. So that would be a good anthology just to pull and read to see how they have, that anthology is divided by regions too. So that's really helpful, like, you know, West, South, East, you know, all the different sort of Texas regions.
Oh, like
think about.
Great ideas. Yeah. Well, I want to pick up on the Cisneros and also on your recommendation earlier to think beyond the traditional literary. One of the things that I do with Cisneros is to look at her website, her self-presentation, her website. And for those of you teaching the AP Lang course, it's a great example of a text that you can look at in terms of its visual culture and her combination of choices that she's made in visual rhetoric and you know, traditional language. And
if you can find, she built an altar to her mother that was displayed at the Smithsonian, which I was fortunate enough to see when it was there. But you can find images online that teaches, and there's interviews of her talking about what it means. That's a great visual component to add to with Cisneros.
Excellent idea. And as a segue then into the next question that I want to share, April Phillips says, I'm looking for narrative essays or excerpts from Texas writers that are particularly engaging. And I don't know if April's one of those Lang teachers, but I forgot to mention this morning that a number of our participants are teaching 11th grade AP, but they're teaching Lang course. So thinking about essays in particular, that, you know, how on that test you're analyzing essays. And so we've been talking about narrative a lot today. But do you have particular essays that you might want to point us to?
So I actually teach a Kinky Friedman short essay, which is wonderful. I can find, I think I have it on the list. I'm blanking on the name too, but it's really great because it has this moment where he talks about being in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and he's this hippie guy traveling through Vietnam, and he sees these Green Berets who he's sure are going to beat him up. But then he hears the one guy talking, and he's like, oh, he's a Texan. Let's see, that accent. Okay, I know where he's from. So he goes over to the guy, and they do that very Texas thing that people do when they're outside of Texas. Oh, are you from Texas? I'm from Texas. What part? Who are your people? And that kind of essay teaches really, really well. So I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about definitely look, and I'm going to hold a book up here, Art the Publica Press, which I mentioned in Houston, has amazing essay collections, especially if you want to add in Hispanic or Latino lit. So for example, this piece is actually this is a narrative, but I was thinking of like Jasmine Mendez. She has this Night Blooming Jasmine, and there's short essays in here. So if you're looking there, I like to include humor. So I look at folks like Molly Ivins, but you know, where's a really great source for essays? It's the Texas Monthly.
Oh yeah.
And they have wonderful essays. Like I teach, there's an essay that this guy writes, and I can find the title. I'd have to go back and dig. He talks about how like he didn't know he was a Texan when he was in Texas, right? And he goes up east and he's like, here's all the ways I'm a Texan, right? So that gives them the sort of reflective moment where they feel authority. but it also is an essay about identity that you can unpack. So Texas Monthly, I strongly recommend their essays for these kinds of issues. And they're going to be contemporary, fascinating essays that the students will feel engaged with. You might have to buy a subscription to their online site. You get so many free, but you can download them and share the PDFs with your students.
All right. A great question has to do with the use of songs, the Cowboy Songs and corridos. When you present these, do you pair them with other texts? Do you do them sort of standalone? Do you do a mix of those? So just to riff a little bit more on what you're doing with those songs.
For the songs, I have decided for this class to put things into like genre chunks, right? So we have a whole, I think we do almost 2 weeks on music, including them bringing in music themselves. So we handle them standalone, but I always do use the text when available. And that's what's really nice about the Cowboy Songs is you have these collected narratives, really. And then when you go to look for Cowboy Songs, what you'll find are versions of them, right? So for those of us that always struggle with like thinking about oracy, thinking about revisioning, this is another way to get at that. But I have them usually read the text. Then we'll listen to 1 or 2 versions. Sometimes there aren't texts, so I do a song about the Texas Brazos River that Lyle Lovett puts out with his large band. I'll do one that works really well is Tom Moore's Farm, which is a blues song, most famously put together by Lightning Hopkins, but there's lots of versions of it. And it was written on a plantation not far from College Station. And in fact, the plantation is still owned by the family. And Tom Moore was notoriously horrific post-slavery to the folks that worked there for him. And it's really strange because you look at the website for the family plantation and they're like, oh, Lightning Hopkins writes this song about, our relatives. And I'm like, it wasn't a nice song. I'm surprised you mentioned it, right? But you can talk about like contemporary revisioning. So and I also show documentaries, little short clips, and I'll talk a little bit about how I use those this afternoon. So I might have a short audio clip of Lightning Hopkins talking about Tom Moore's song and why it was so dangerous to write that kind of song. And then he'll sing it, and then we'll watch a contemporary musicologist discussing how this particular song arose out of the Texas blues, right? So we tie all that together. So I think you can't teach them without a context, but there's lots of pieces out there. Like NPR, I always use to talk about cowboy songs. They have a great piece on the diversity of Texas cowboys, because in some counties in Texas, cowboys were something like 80% African-American cowboys. And it's sort of like that image has been lost, right? We might talk about vaqueros, but there's not sort of the black cowboy doesn't show up as much in broader culture.
Well, I know we're almost to a point where